is I, Candace Naravan Dracovin, Lord and Emperor of the Dracovin Empire, and welcome. It is time to continue my expose on the history of Magic the Gathering. This week, I'm introducing to you Mercadian Masques. Now, Mercadian Masques was released on October 4th, 1999, and it had a pre-release on September 25th of 1999. It was the first set in the Masques block. It was also the first set not protected under the reserved list. Now, the reserved list, if you don't understand what it is every set that was released, including core sets and expansions, before Mercadian Masques has at least a few cards on it on the reserve list. These are cards which will not be printed again. So they are cards beyond reproach for being reprinted, which the reserve list has been edited here and there, but, of course, after Mercadian Masques, nothing got on the reserve list, so it's really only classic and older cards. Now, the set had 350 cards, and its symbol was a stylized mask representing the intrigue and deception that existed within the Mercadian society. It was also the first large expansion to be printed under the 6th edition rules. Now, there were no new keywords, but there were a number of new mechanics and themes. Mercenaries, rebels, spell shapers, alternate cost cards, recruiters, depletion lands, and storage lands. Now, it was sold in 75 card tournament packs, of course 15 card booster packs, and 4 pre-constructed decks. It was the first set to have foil lands be included within the foil, so it was the first set that you could get an entire foil copy of said set. Before then, basic lands hadn't had foils for them. Non-basic lands did when they started doing the foils, but this one was that first one with the foil cards that had actual basic lands. Now, the art on the booster packs included 3 different pictures, including the Squee Goblin Naboo. Now, this was the first set to have a fat pack, a specialized pack which you would get a number of things in. This version of a fat pack, which was very different from the modern ones you can get nowadays, had 3 booster packs, a tournament deck, 2 premium ads, the top deck magazines, pull-out material on Mercadian Masques, and the Mercadian Masques novel. There was no official guide in this set, unlike some of the other ones before that did have those. The pre-release card was, of course, a foil Overtaker. Now, Mercadian Masques is unique that, in fact, the novel department, the one writing the novelization of this set, was the one that came up with the name of it. They called the novel Mercadian Masques. Originally, that wasn't going to be the name for a set, but eventually the department designing the set caved in and decided it was a fine enough name to actually name the set after. So the storyline of it takes the Weatherlight having escaped from Wrath, crash landing on a strange new plane. There they are accosted by the cho-arrm, a group of rebels going against the Mercadians, the sort of overlords of this plane. They capture the Weatherlight and a number of the crew, led by this figure cho-manno. The rest of the crew then gets accosted by soldiers from Mercadian City and arrested themselves. So cho-arrm, who was one of the ones captured, learned that the cho-arrm believe that the Weatherlight is a sign of their deity Ramos returning in order to help liberate them from the control of the Mercadians. So that is their entire point for capturing the Weatherlight. On the other hand, Gerald and the rest of the crew, they eventually are able to make some kind of deal with the Mercadians. The Mercadians are kind of shifty, distrustful of each other. The nobles are kind of lazy and hedonistic, and it looks like the goblins of the city, which are like taller and a lot smarter than the goblins that they're used to, aka Squee, are actually the ones in charge of the city. But they do make a deal that Gerald will lead a group of soldiers to recapture the Weatherlight. Turns out he's given Carterans, which are this mercenary group that is very vicious. They slaughter a lot of the cho-arrm. In the result of it, the Weatherlight is recaptured and taken back. In order, basically, they would get Weatherlight back, the rest of their crew back, and then they would negotiate for their freedom. In the meantime, though, they do sort of renegotiate the deal with the Mercadians that they actually get, that they can get away. It ends up that they have to send a number of their representatives to the Sprazams. They're a group of merfolk which run a rival trade city that have the ability to change between fins and legs. So this group of merfolk has this unique ability. There they get an artifact, acquire it, that will be able to repair the Weatherlight. So at this point in time, though, they do manage to free the crew and the Weatherlight and escape. But along the way, they find some Thuran ruins under the control of these dryads and fight a basic war machine that exists there before being able to finally escape from the plane. So it's a very complex story leading into the invasion storyline that's going to come in from sets to come. And it does set up some of these storylines with like cho-arrm falling in love with cho-manno and eventually returning here after all is said and done with the invasion when she survives it. Also kind of the Mercadian city that the goblins and technically under Phyrexian control, which doesn't really dive into it too much, but technically the Mercadia is indirectly under the control of Phyrexians too. So it's a very interesting storyline that you can dive a lot more deeper into if you want to read the novel or get some of that basic information. I've talked a little about it in my series where I was talking about Squee and other members of the Weatherlight. Now, Mercadian Masques, though it has some cards which are still popular and useful from it, is also considered weaker than the Urza's block, because a lot of what happened with the combo Winter and Urza's block, Magic took a step back in trying to power down the cards a little bit. And again, they were mostly successful, but there were a few cards that became very popular in the tournament circuit, which meant that the set itself maintained some momentum in comparison to previous ones, which they tried to be very powerless, which have been very unpopular. Now, as I said, the key mechanics that existed were first the Rebels and the Mercenaries. The Rebels and Mercenaries both had this ability that you could tap them with a number of mana, search your library for a creature type, the appropriate one, either Rebel or Mercenary, reveal it and put it into play. So effectively, you could recruit a creature from your deck and put it into play for a mana cost with this type of creature. They also had the Spell Shapers. A Spell Shaper was a creature that was in play that you could use its ability cost, effectively discard a card from your hand and change it into an ability of that creature. Effectively, you're shaping it into a more classic ability that existed. Traditionally, it was something that, like an older card, it would be mimicking, like destroying a land, like something like Stone Rain, that effectively you're paying the same cost as Stone Rain with a Spell Shaper, but you're changing a card from your hand into that. So if you had like an extra land or a card you don't need, you could change it into something else with a Spell Shaper. They, of course, did bring back alternate cost spells, which hadn't really existed since Visions. Ones that you could do some kind of alternate paying in order to pay its mana cost, something alternate than it would be normally. They also introduced a number of creatures that had an ability that any player could use. That means any player could pay its mana cost, even though you would have that creature under control on your side. It basically opened it up that it had a activated ability anybody could play. Now, the set had 15 cycles and 4 vertical cycles. Pretty impressive. It had 4 cycles of Spell Shapers. It had 2 common ones, a normal common one, what's called an alpha common one, with the alpha being based upon abilities from the alpha set. It had an uncommon cycle of Spell Shapers and a rare cycle of Spell Shapers. So that was really impressive for 4 right there. Added a cycle of ability walls, walls that had tap abilities that they could use to grant some kind of ability. A cycle of legates, creatures that if an opponent controlled a certain basic land, you could effectively play it for free. A cycle of mongers, the creatures that could have abilities that any player could play them, that any player could play its mana cost. A cycle of unwilling creatures, creatures that when it came into play, it would give your opponent something in order for you to play it effectively. A cycle of instant enchantments, enchantments that you could play with flash, as you could play as an instant. A cycle of color hate spells that did things to the 2 rival colors of the set. So effectively it was white, it would do something to black and red. A cycle of alternate cost spells, where if you had a certain basic land that matches the spell, you could you'd have an alternate cost that you could pay. A cycle of rare pitch cards, where you could effectively exile a card of a certain color or a certain type of card, and you could cast that spell for free as an alternate cost. A cycle of Ramos artifacts. There were 5 Ramos artifacts that you could choose from, each with different abilities. A cycle of depletion lands. The depletion lands came with 2 counters on them, and when you would tap it, you would remove one of that counter for 2 of a mana of a certain color. Once it ran out of depletion counters on it, you would sacrifice the land. So, yes, the land didn't last very long, but you could get this sudden burst of 2 mana each turn from it. a cycle of storage lands. This was effectively replacing the kind of storage lands that existed during fallen empires. This version of it, you could either tap it and add a storage counter onto it, or you could tap and remove any number of storage counters and get 1 mana of the appropriate color of the storage land to your mana pool for each storage counter removed. It was a lot better and more efficient than the Fallen Empires version. So as I said, there was 4 vertical cycles. There was a cycle of character and recruiters. These were the ones that would recruit mercenaries, that you would tap an amount of mana, search your library, put a mercenary play. There was flailing creatures. Flailing creatures, each of them had an ability that could either raise or lower their power/toughness that any player could play. So effectively, I could play to make it bigger, or an opponent could pay to make it smaller. There was also the Ramosin recruiters, ones that recruited rebels. So that was the opposite of the Karaten ones, which recruit mercenaries. This one was the rebel ones, where you would tap the mana, search your library, put a rebel into play. And there was also a cycle of Rashidan pirates, that each of them had an ability that something bad would happen to an opponent when it would come into play. Effectively, each of the opponents of the players, the person who played the creature's opponents, had to pay a certain cost, or they would have to sacrifice a permanent. There were 21 reprints in the set, including lore, and 17 functional reprints, including Thran Glider for Goblin Glider. Now, the pre-constructed decks were Deepwood Menace, which was red-green, Disruptor, which was black-red, Mercenary's Call, which was white, and Untitled Mask, which was white-blue. Now, the cards from this set that I wanted to talk about were, of course, Arrest. Arrest is when you played on a creature, it couldn't attack or block, but it also couldn't use its activated abilities. It's a little better than some of the other types of cards that had similar effects. There was, of course, Bribery, where you would search your opponent's library for a creature and put it into play under your control. Effectively, you're stealing a creature from an opponent's library. There was Kartan Overlord, where you could sacrifice a creature to regenerate it, or you could pay 6 mana, tap it, and search your library for a 6 mana or less mercenary and put it into play. So it was the top-of-the-line mercenary. Cho-manno Revolutionary. Prevent all damage that would be dealt to cho-manno. Collective Unconscious. Draw a card for each creature you have in play. Coastal Piracy. If a creature you control should deal damage to an opponent, you may draw a card. Diplomatic Immunity. Enchanted creature has Shroud. Diplomatic Immunity has Shroud. There's Fountain Watch. Artifacts and enchantments you control have Shroud. Ivory Mask. You have Shroud. So there was a lot of things that would give Shroud, that nothing can target with any spell or ability. There's Magistrate Scepter. For 4 mana tap, you could put a charge counter on it, but then you could tap it and remove 3 charge counters from it to take an extra turn after this one. Misdirection. You could exile a blue card instead of paying its normal mana cost, but you target spell which targets a single target. So a spell is targeting a single target. You can change that target to a different target of your choice. So effectively, you're switching the targets of a single target spell. It says target a lot in that entire sentence. There's Ramosin Sky Captain, 3/3 flyer that for 7 mana you could tap. You could search your library for a 6 mana cost or less rebel and put it into play. So it's one of the top of the line rebels. Rashidan Port. You could tap it for a colorless mana or tap 1 mana and tap it to tap target land. It's actually pretty good because you can get rid of a land from an opponent's control. There's Security Detail. For 2 white, you could put a 1/1 soldier creature into play only if you control no other creatures, and you could only do it once a turn. Soothsaying. For 3 colorless and 2 blue, you could shuffle your library. Or for X, you could look at the top X cards of your library and put them back in any order. Soothsaying is still really good and powerful. If you have a lot of mana, you can rearrange the top of your deck. So there's Squee, Goblin Naboo. Now, Squee is a 1/1 creature, but his ability is that at the beginning of your upkeep, if he's in your graveyard, you can turn him to your hand. So you could always replay him again. He effectively was kind of immortal as long as he didn't get removed from the game. There's Story Circle. When it came into play, you would choose a color. This would effectively be very similar to the circle protections of old. You would pay a white mana and you could prevent the damage from the next source of the color that you had chosen from dealing that damage to you. So you prevent a damage from a color. If you chose red, you prevent red damage to you from etc., etc. It worked just like the circle protections did before, but you choose a color when it comes to play rather than being a direct color. Waterfront Bouncer. It was a spell shaper. For 4 mana, tap, and discarding a card, you could return target creature to its owner's hand. So it was a way to bounce creatures to their opponent's hand. Then there's Ancestral Mask. An enchanted creature gets +2/+2 for each enchantment in play. So the more enchantments are in play, the bigger your enchanted creature becomes. There's Arms Dealer. It is a 1/1 goblin that for 1 colorless and 1 red, you could sacrifice a goblin to deal 4 damage to target creature. Effectively, you could blow up goblins to damage creatures. There's Ballista Squad. For X and tapping it, you do X damage to target attacking or blocking creature. So the creatures that would deal damage or affect attacking and blocking creatures, this was the ultimate version of it because you could just do X damage to some of them. Black Market. When a creature would be put into the graveyard from play, you put a counter on the Black Market. During your pre-combat main phase, you got 1 black mana for each counter on black markets. So if a lot of creatures are dying or if you have a sacrificial deck, it was a great way of gaining a lot of mana in your first main phase. Charisma. Whenever enchanted creature dealt damage to another creature, you gain control of that creature as long as Charisma is in play. So if you had a creature that could tap to deal damage or had an alternate way of dealing damage to other creatures, this was a great way of stealing them. There was Conspiracy. When it came into play, you chose a creature type. All creatures under your control in play are that creature type. Every creature card that is in your hand, graveyard, and library counts as that creature type for anything that might target it. So effectively, you change your deck into all of blank creature. There was Extortion. You looked at target player's hand, you chose 2 cards from it, they discarded it. A good way of getting 2 cards of your choice from an opponent's hand. There's Forced March. It has an X cost to it. You destroy each creature with a converted mana cost of X or less. So if you had some very big converted mana cost creatures and your opponents did not, you could effectively wipe all of them out by just paying X mana. There's Groundskeeper. For colorless and a green, you return a basic land from your graveyard to your hand. There's Haunted Crossroads. For 1 black mana, you can take a creature card from your graveyard and put it on top of your library. A great way of getting back creature cards. There's Intimidation. All your creatures have fear. This was before the term fear was coined, but effectively cannot be blocked except by black and artifact creatures. Inviolability. Prevent all damage that be dealt to the enchanted creature. It was the precursor for indestructible, in a way. It just prevented all damage from being dealt to your creatures. Leylines. At the beginning of each player's upkeep, they choose a creature they control and put a +1/+1 counter on it. So it's spreading the +1/+1 counter love among very many number of creatures. Larceny. When a creature you control deals combat damage to an opponent, they discard a card. As simple and wonderful as that. Moonlight Veil. Whenever a creature is put in the graveyard from play, you may gain 1 life. Good way of getting a lot of sacrifice and destruction decks to gain a lot of life. Noble Purpose. Whenever a creature you control deals combat damage, you gain that much life. Not quite lifelink, but stacks with it because of the wording on it. So you could technically have the both of them together. Reign of Tears. Destroy target land. It was a black card that destroyed a land. Now granted, there are some, but it's more of a red ability to destroy land. So this mix and matched a little bit of it. Robberfly, a 1/1 flyer. That when it becomes blocked, the opponent that is blocking it discards their hand and draws that many cards. It is a creature that people don't want to block because of its negative abilities. It is on those lists of those type of creatures that, you could block it and kill it off, or you could live with it and not have to deal with the shenanigans that it would cause by blocking. There's Saber Ants, a 2/3 insect creature that whenever it's dealt damage, you put that many 1/1 insect tokens into play. So if you combined it with something like Lore, which I did say was reprinted, a lot of damage will be dealt to your Saber Ant, and you get a lot of 1/1 green insects. There's Spraz and Air. It is another one of those ones that you don't really want to block, but maybe want to get rid of. It's a 1/1. Whenever it becomes blocked, you may draw 3 cards. So you could throw it at an opponent and see if they actually want to block it. Spider Silk Armor. Your creatures get +0/+1 and have reach. This is a really good green enchantment, and I would recommend checking it out. It gives all your creatures, green creatures, or at least all your creatures in play in general, an ability to block flying, which green has tended to have a big lack of. So this is a great way of adding it in safely, and also giving a little boost to your creatures that they're a little harder to kill. Squeeze. It's an enchantment. Sorcery spells cost 3 more to play. It's a way of kind of messing around with people that play a lot of sorceries. Tidal Kraken. It's a 6/6 unblockable. That's all you have to say about it. It's a 6/6 unblockable. Any blue deck that had Tidal Kraken back in the day was pretty fearsome. You really had to deal with that, and it was not pleasant. Trap Runner. Tap it, target unblocked creature becomes blocked. Now this really just means that creature is blocked. Any kind of ability or effect that happens when this creature becomes blocked, whether on their opponent's side or your side, would go into effect. This, of course, means Trap Runner was useless against something like Trample. Just because it's blocked doesn't mean it's not going to trample over. There's no damage or something that is going to hit first. All the damage will be dealt through. But on the other hand, if you had things that, you wanted to block it and you don't want to block it directly with Trap Runner, you could tap Trap Runner and block something and, keep it from dealing damage to you. There's Undertaker. It's a spell shaper. For a black, tapping it, discarding a card, you return a creature card from your graveyard to your hand. So it was a way of getting creature cards back, effectively like Raise Dead, but spell shaper version of it. So you could just get rid of cards you didn't want to do it. Unnatural Hunger. You enchant an opponent's creature at the beginning of that player's upkeep, that controller's upkeep. They either have to sacrifice a creature or take damage equal to the power of that creature. So effectively, they make your opponents have to sacrifice creatures to the creature they really want to keep. Vernal Equinox. Players can play creatures and enchantments as though they had flash. So it gives everything flash, but still, Vine Trellis. It's one of those tapping walls. As 0/4 wall, you can tap it for a green mana. It's actually pretty good. War Cadence. For X and a red, creatures can't be blocked this turn unless their controller pays X mana. So effectively, you can make it that your creatures are pretty unblockable. Granted, your opponent could probably pay that X a few times, maybe, if they have more mana than you, to block a few of your creatures, but it makes it much more selective what they're going to block, and they have to have that mana open, just as you have to have that mana open to force them to use it to block your creatures. The opposite of that, of course, is War Tax. X and a blue. It's for another enchantment similar, but it's X and a blue. And then an opponent can't attack you unless they pay X for each creature attacking you. It makes it that on an opponent's turn, it's expensive to attack you with any number of creatures, and then they attack you with less creatures because you only paid once for the X, and they have to pay X multiple times for each creature they're trying to attack you with. So that's it for today. I introduced you to Mercadian Masques, an interesting set that was less power than the Urza's block, but still had a number of cards which were actually really great, and I would recommend checking out and using in some of your decks even now. I use a bunch of Mercadian Masque cards for many combos that I have in various decks. They're still that good and as useful as they could ever be. It's just that the set as a whole just wasn't as powerful. So if you have any questions, comments, anything you would say, anything you think I left out, please leave in the comments below. Please like, share, and subscribe to support the channel, the empire of the work I do. If you want to show some extra support, you can always check out my Patreon, link in the description below. If you want to check out some more Magic content on the days that I'm not putting out anything, you could always check out Card Bazaar. They Said, We Said, and Tasty Snackies. My friends of the multiverse, they do some interesting Magic stuff that I would recommend checking out also. But regardless, until the next time, I bid you farewell.